First, quick bit about Geovation in case you weren't aware. Geovation, we are a accelerator and community based in London, supporting startups to use geospatial data. So far, we've supported over 250 startups that have raised over 155 million in funding. But most importantly, we've created a huge number of jobs and supported people getting value from geospatial data. Our credentials, what makes us good people to speak about open data? Well, Dave has won an award on it. That's a pretty good indication. So Dave won a British Empire Medal for his work on Libraries Hacked, which is obviously an incredible achievement. So Dave has won a medal for his work with Libraries Hacked. I've worked in two organisations now that have had challenges around how to best make their data open, and those discussions are obviously really hard for an organisation sometimes. And obviously, we now work at Geovation where we are massive advocates for open data. So I think we've got pretty good credentials to talk about it. Dave, over to you.
Hi all. Yeah, so I want to start talking a bit about what we mean by open, and I think a lot of people already know, but one thing it's worth kind of establishing at the start is that we have clear definitions for when we're talking about open. It is a clear thing, and the reason I kind of say that is that it's quite often used as not a non-clear thing. So you might find software suppliers often talk about their solutions being open, or they kind of say they embrace open working, or they kind of use it as a kind of vague, hard to define entity. And that's not the way we're talking about open here. We're being quite distinct about what we mean by open. So a few other examples of the kind of open ecosystem of open source. Open source means that you are publishing software with source code that anyone can go and inspect, modify, and even enhance really to be properly open source, contribute. Open access is more about research and publications, and you get journals which are open access, and that's very clear about the fact that when you're publishing an open access journal, you do need to be specific about the fact that people are able to freely access that research. Same with open government. There's clear and defined measures about what we mean by open government, certain transparency obligations, certain data sets that government should be releasing, things like payments and building ownership and all kinds of things we say if you're an open government, you should be publishing this kind of data, and also open standards. So the standards we use for things like using time zones and all that kind of stuff are standards that everyone sort of knows and understands, or light bulbs, all those kind of things are standards. And open standards mean that standard has to be kind of openly available for all to use. That's fine. So open data. Now, obviously, that was all about different things that are open. Open data, there's no one definition, but this is one from the Open Data Institute, and they seem like the kind of people who should be producing a definition. And I like this because it's short and clear and also includes a lot of information in it. So open data is data that anyone can access, use, and share. So there's kind of four key things there. Anyone. There has to be kind of no barrier to who can be using your data. You can't sort of say big businesses can't use this, or you can't even say bad people can't use this. Or when you want good people using the data, you say anyone can use this data. It has to be able to be accessed. So, ideally published online, no kind of barriers to sign up or pay or do anything like that to kind of get hold of it. And then you have to have the relative rights to actually use it and share it. And also people sort of say reuse as well. So use and reuse, but effectively be able to do things with it and then publish things that you've done with it and allow other people to kind of reuse it as well. So why do we do open, and why do we do open data? I think on a broad principle, all our kind of knowledge within society is built upon the kind of open knowledge principle. We build things, we establish new insight, we create new things, and we allow other people to use that as well and then build upon it. There are some restrictions. Obviously, we have intellectual property, we have copyright, but actually those are fairly restricted. And actually, our default position is open knowledge. In society, it tends to be that we ensure things are open and for the benefit of the public. Intellectual property is a restriction that you can ensure is applied to your product. Same with copyright, but there are always restrictions on how far that goes. With copyright, it's a certain length of time that copyright applies. So our default position is open knowledge, and certainly within sort of public sector and other organizations, we take the default position that open data, data should be public. Other benefits are things like the maximum reach. The more people that get to see the data, the better. If we think it's there that something's useful, obviously it kind of benefits more people getting hold of it. It also improves the quality. So the more people looking at something, the kind of more people who are going to say, well, there's something wrong here, I can kind of report an issue with this data. We'll kind of get onto examples, but that's how kind of OpenStreetMap works. You probably often see on maps based on OpenStreetMap data, they'll say, any issues, go and report this. From the public sector point of view, the data has normally been paid for. The kind of work that's gone behind that data has been paid for by the public. So it's kind of reasonable for the public to expect to be able to reuse that data. And also, we should remember that freedom of information exists. So there's often ways of getting hold of data that have more friction than open data. Open data is a kind of enhancement that actually allows people to get hold of data in an easy way. Also, from the publisher's point of view, it allows them to dictate the way they want to publish that data, provide the documentation, provide it in the way it's meant to be, and aren't just kind of responding to freedom of information requests. The one last thing I kind of want to say is that the other thing open data isn't, it's not the kind of equivalent of just finding a £10 note in the street. You can't just sort of see, you can't go on a website, see something and go, well, that's open data, it's on a website. Open data is kind of predicated on the fact that you need a license for it. And that license is important. It protects the publisher. The publisher can sort of say, you can use this data, but we sort of disclaim all responsibility for what you do with it. And similarly, the person reusing the data can say, you're clearly giving me the right to use and reuse this data. So I know that you can't come back to me in the future and go, hey, that was our data, we're going to sue you for using it. So it's important to have a license. From the public domain, from the public sector point of view, the open government license tends to be used, and there's a version 3 out there. There's also the option to kind of release things in the public domain, or often known as the unlicensed, and it still has a license, which kind of can seem a bit back to front, but it's effectively saying this is just unlicensed data. It's a formal statement to say that we're releasing this into the public domain. We have no copyright, any kind of formal claim over it. And the other word of warning is also when you're publishing data is to avoid code licenses. Some people tend to release open data under things like the MIT license. Now, the MIT license is based upon releasing software, so it doesn't quite work from a data point of view. So do make sure you're using a data license when you are either publishing, or ideally, if you're reusing data, you should have be using it under a data license. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to talk about open data from the perspective of being somebody that has tried to share open data from a government agency before. And there's lots of people that are in this position around government. So a few bits of feedback. Try not to be a passive user of open data as much as you can. So if something isn't working for you, or if it is working, feedback to the people that are maintaining that data, because there's a lot of effort that goes into making data open. It's a huge task. It's very complex. The organizational challenges that you face sometimes when you push data open or maintaining that open data, actually good feedback helps a lot. And sometimes you put a link up and the only thing you'll see is a download statistic, and you can see that going up and up, but you don't really have an idea about how that data is actually being used. So be good users of the data if you can. And that goes towards understanding the licenses, as Dave just mentioned, but also when you attribute your sources, talk about how, on your website or on your tool, whatever you're doing, talk about where that data has come from and how you're using it, and make sure you're helping. Let's dive into some data. So first data set that we're huge fans of. The Environment Agency LiDAR data. I'm sure many of you have looked at this data before. It comes in many formats. That's one thing worth saying. So there is a web mapping service variant of this data. There is the raw data itself as effectively LiDAR point clouds. They are the LiDAR point cloud data is quite unwieldy in size. It's quite tricky to use. The most common data set that we use all the time at the moment is that there's the composite data. That's the one on the screen at the moment. That comes in tiled geotiffs around the UK. It's still unwieldy in size. It's about 300 gigs to download. If you do want to download the whole data set, the Environment Agency are brilliant. You can send them a link or send them an email. Sorry, they will send you a link to an FTP site and you can download all of that data and you can get access to it. It's not the easiest FTP site in the world to use. It is a bit tricky sometimes to get it to download the whole data set, but it's roughly 300 gigs. What does this data let you do? It's a 1 meter or 2 meter resolution digital terrain model or digital elevation model, depending on your needs, for nearly the whole of the UK. There was a small gap in Scotland, unfortunately, but it's nearly the whole of the UK, and it's brilliant data in terms of what does an elevation model do. If you need to know height above sea level, if you need to know gradients, topology, terrain, line of sight analysis, it's fantastic data and it's completely open. It's probably the best data set of its kind in the UK. That, you know, there are some commercial offerings that might be slightly higher resolution, but this is really good and it's completely free. So you'd be absolutely crazy not to be making the use of it if you wanted to. In terms of tooling, how do you actually use it? Really, there's a multitude of options, but it can be hosted on the web quite easily using something like cloud optimized GeoTIFF or virtual rasters if you need to use it server side. It's brilliant data, so definitely have a look at it if you haven't already. There's a very handy tool to download small sample areas as well. So if you only need to look at certain sites, there's quite a handy tool to just download small samples rather than downloading the whole data set in one go. Another data set that we are huge fans of, and this is an incredible data set, is the Met Office HAD UK data. So obviously in the UK, weather it plays an important part of our lives. The HAD UK data, it's not live weather, it's historic weather data going back to 1961. There is a number of factors that you can look at, but the main ones that are pretty awesome are rainfall, temperature, sunshine, and wind. Those data sets you can have up to like a 1 kilometer grid size. And you can get that for days, weeks, or months, or even years if you wanted to. It depends on how kind of granularly you want to get into that data. It's a NetCDF format, so that's quite a scientifically orientated format. If you've not come across it, it's kind of like a data cube. So there's an X and a Y grid, and then there's kind of the Z, which is time effectively. So you get the data quite stacked on top of each other. So it's not the easiest data set in the world to use sometimes, but in terms of value, it's phenomenal. It's because, historic weather, it can start to let you look at terms of creating climate for geographies. So if you wanted, for instance, to kind of group together similar kind of climates around the UK, that's quite easy to do. We did that for one of the startups about 2 years ago, trying to find farms that had similar weather systems, even though they were in very different parts of the UK, and that worked really well. And it's a great data set. We would probably recommend not keeping it in NetCDF format, get it out of that and put it into a format that is easier for you to use, potentially in a database, but it's a really valuable data set and it's really good to use and obviously free. Right. BGS, British Geological Survey, they have a huge range of open data. Unfortunately, some of that data is there is a premium version that has more attribution in it, but there is still lots of really good open data in there as well. And it's great for site assessments or site viability or building or insurance, things like subsidence, coastal erosion, landslides, corrosion of underground assets. It's a great data. The one I've got here at the moment is the risk of subsidence, and it's on a nice hex grid, so it's really lightweight, quick to use, and it's a great data set. One data that we see people using all the time, but I still don't think people are capturing enough value out of it. So this is the MHCLG's energy performance certificate data set. So what I've done here, I have done something cheeky and I've joined it to buildings data, but just showing you a JSON image of, an image of just some JSON data didn't feel like a very good thing for a slide. So I have joined this as some OS data. So one of the good parts of that data set is it does have a universal property record number, so you can join it against other data sets really easily. Here, the top image is energy performance, and then the bottom image is the number of extensions. Roughly 40% of properties in the UK won't have a valid energy performance certificate. So there is going to be some gaps in that data, but actually, on the whole, you can infill that data quite easily if you look at, houses in a similar area, and it contains a lot of the value in terms of understanding the kind of the type, the shape of the property, and what it's actually doing. And from a terms of on the ground, actually in the property, it's the best data set I know of for kind of understanding the UK's national housing assets effectively. It's worth highlighting some of the data can be a bit questionable. You do need to do a sense check on it sometimes. There is going to be a lot of noise in the data, especially if you've got people, that there's stories about people doing virtual EPCs and all sorts of stuff. So don't always take it as gospel about what's actually in it. Do some sense checking on it before you integrate with that data and trust it completely. But it's really great data considering its breadth and its availability. Right. This one's really fun, close to my heart. So I used to work for UKHO, and I thought it'd be a bit unfair to only talk about land-based data. There's some really good data out there around oceanographic data if you need it. So around the UK, the oceans and the seas are surveyed consistently, and that bathymetric data is available publicly for free. You can go in, you can download the survey, and you know what, the ocean doesn't have to be just one shade of blue. It's absolutely fantastic data. It's very accurate, up to about 1 to 2 meter in terms of granularity in some cases. Some of the older surveys will go to like 5 to 10 meter spatial resolution, so a little bit more coarse, but still very accurate if you're doing any engineering works or you wanted to analyze all sorts of things. It's a fantastic data set and worth having a look at. And it's worth saying, I've put a link to all of these data accesses on the slide, so if you want to click through, you can. And then 2 more from me. So this is a great data set if you're needing to make a quiz randomly. So I did this for a quiz for the Geovation team recently. There is Ordnance Survey's open names data set. Obviously, Ordnance Survey has a huge amount of open data, but I wanted to highlight 2 that I really like. So open names contains locations of names, road numbers, and postcodes around the UK. It has a fantastic kind of breadth of names, and then I've just highlighted a few that I quite like. But it's a really good data set to work with, and obviously completely open. And then finally, from me, Green Space is another fantastic OS data set in terms of openness. It contains locations of parks, green spaces, and in rural and urban areas. Think things like fields, parks, playing facilities, sports facilities, and there's also access point locations in there as well. So if you need to know how to access them, you can do that really easily. Open data set, links there as well. Really great one to look at if you're doing anything like trying to understand people's access to green spaces. In terms of some of these other data sets, the value of open data isn't how you use it on its own, it's how you combine it with other things. And obviously, Dave's going to go on and talk about a lot of the kind of ONS type data, and this all plays a part in trying to understand, the makeup of our land. Dave, over to you.
Thank you. Actually, before I go on to Office for National Statistics data, I was going to mention on OS Places, we quite often get people who need to do or think they need to do an address lookup. So they think they need to kind of like, the user will need to enter their address to provide their service. Now, unless you actually need the user's actual exact address, which you quite often do, OS Places can be a really useful way of just putting in the approximate location. So it could be street level, street name, or it could be a nearby place, or it could be the postcode. Quite often when you're doing lookups for places, you're not actually interested in the exact location, you're interested in sort of the place somewhere is. So it's a perfectly good free data set to use OS Places for your kind of primary place lookup in your app or service, whatever it is. Anyway, output areas. So this isn't exclusively talking about output areas, but when we're analysing people, and specifically when we're analysing data from, say, organisations like the Office for National Statistics, we need geographies that are focused on people. Now, quite often people will tend to use things like postcodes. So they group together by, say, postcode or postcode area or postcode district. That tends to be really bad because those are geographies that are used for delivering letters. They're not used for analyzing people. So a postcode could have one person in it, it could have 0 people in it, or it could have hundreds of people in it. And they're not particularly useful for sort of saying, here's this group of people over here. They have these attributes and these sort of stats about them compared to this group over here. So what the ONS do is they have these statistical geographies which sort of start small, output areas, and get steadily bigger. So you have output areas, medium level super output areas, and then lower level super output areas, which are a bit bigger. There's about 300 people, and they tend to be uniform depending on how many people are in them. So our output areas tend to have about 300 people in them, going up to lower super output areas, which have 1,500 people. And I think actually, so I said medium level were smaller before, but they're the larger areas. So medium level and the bigger ones, so I think around have about 5,000 odd people in them. They fit kind of naturally within human and natural and the natural geography. So what I mean by that is they sort of run along roads, or they run around kind of natural geographies like rivers and things like that. They don't tend to be just sort of gridded square lines that could go through any, could go through houses, could go through other geographies without kind of making sense. The important thing about that is that quite often people use sort of gridded geographies or hexagon geographies more frequently to kind of analyze groups of people. But of course, they tend to be uniform in size rather than uniform in terms of people. And the ONS geographies are uniform in terms of people, but also because they fit around the kind of natural environment and the kind of human environment, they tend to represent communities really well. So it's kind of valid to kind of think of, if you have a particular output area. I've got one on the screen, which is sort of a sort of ruralish location in Bradford-on-Avon. They kind of fit around natural communities, so they might fit around a hamlet, and those people kind of, even though they don't identify with the output area, because no one kind of thinks in output areas, they'll probably identify with the other people in the output area. And they're also coterminous with other government geographies. So what that means is wards, for example, which are local government geography, will all have a specific number, well, not a specific number, but the output areas will make up the ward higher level geography, and then the wards will go and make up the kind of local authority boundaries. Local authority boundaries go up to make the regional boundaries. So they all kind of fit into each other quite nicely, which is useful if you're kind of analysing the output areas within the local authority or within the region. They all kind of fit exactly within the relevant geographies. So I tend to show this diagram not to kind of go through every bit of it, because that would take hours, but it's a representation of the UK geographies, not only statistical geographies, but kind of all geographies. So it's got things like postal codes in there and postcode areas and district sectors and the postcode unit, which is the smallest unit of postcode, effectively your whole postcode. But also kind of administrative geographies, things like local government, census geographies, which are those output areas, lower super output areas, medium level super output areas. And it's just a complicated landscape, but they do kind of all work together, or at least you can make them work together. If you go into the ONS GeoPortal, there's a lot of lookups between them all. So if you have, say, a postcode, you can normally find a lookup that will take you from postcode to output area, for example. And this was just to focus on, so one data set published by MHCLG is known as the indices of deprivation. So this is a usage of LSOAs. So an exercise that happens every now and again, so I think the last time was in 2019, is analysis is done of quite a lot of raw data to create these indices of deprivation across different deprivation measures. So income, employment, education skills, health and disability, crime, barriers to housing and living environment. Now, what that does is it ranks all the LSOAs in order, effectively, for all these measures. So you can kind of, from crime, you can say, okay, we've got 35,000 LSOAs. Here's the one with the most crime. Here's the one with the least crime. And you produce a rank across all those LSOAs. And that creates a really useful comparative data set between all of them. It's quite difficult to kind of use those rankings because there'll be things like, 29,000 out of 35,000. So what they also do is create a decile. So there's a decile for each one of those rankings to say an area is just 1 to 10, 1 being the most deprived in whatever measure, and 10 being the least deprived. So we've got an example on the screen, which is an area of Lancashire, and there's just the sort of the heavy shading is an area called Briarfield, where there's I think 3 or 4 LSOAs, which are the most deprived in, well, part of that sort of 10% most deprived in England and Wales. Another one we have used in the past is air quality. So I used to work in local government at Bath and Nottingham, Somerset, and we had local air quality management areas. So it was a function of local government. They had to monitor areas of particularly high or particularly poor air quality. One in Bath was the London Road, a lot of traffic coming into Bath, a lot of lorries. Bath is kind of in a valley, so it built up lots of pollutants that didn't have anywhere to go, and they kind of built up. So they had to have air quality monitoring. Now that's kind of useful, and we actually did as a community a lot of analysis of Bath's air quality. But one thing DEFRA do is they use local monitoring and other kind of other modelling to create 1 kilometre resolution pollution maps. So if you do want to do modelling across the UK, you've got, or actually looks like you've just got England there. The DEFRA data will give you the 1 kilometre grids across the various pollutants. So things like particulate matter, nitrogen oxide and dioxide, carbon monoxide, SO2, ozone, and benzene. It will give you that kind of modelling. Some of it's quite complicated to use because there's different kind of measures as to what is good, what is bad, depending on whether it's the mean over time, whether it's sort of instances of exceeding recommended levels, number of times you exceed it over a year. There's some quite complicated kind of ways of which you need to use that data and kind of interpret it. But the DEFRA data is a good open data set. One word of caution on it is kind of it's a bit messy, and you have to go onto the website and sort of right click and download save as, and there's not kind of nice naming of the files, so it tends to be a bit manual as to how you get hold of it. And I think this is the final one for me, but one that I just really like is both open source and crowdsourced project to collect memorial benches. So you'll quite often go walking in a park by the coast and kind of find a memorial bench. And I think Terence Eden had the idea to create a website to kind of crowdsource all these, and it's now at 35,000. It's a huge data set, actually expands not just UK but into Europe and beyond. And what you do is when you're out and about, go onto the website, you see a bench, take a photo, it'll automatically use the geolocation, automatically detect the inscription as long as you've got the inscription on the photo. And that's all in a database which is presented on the website, but also provides nightly downloads. So you can kind of use that data. One thing I used it for was in a personal project. I was kind of creating a heritage map. So kind of it would have kind of libraries, museums, galleries. And what I wanted to do was kind of show things that were kind of relevant in that kind of heritage context. So I also created a kind of vector tile set of open benches. So as you zoom into the map, you kind of get the inscription and the bench displayed on the map, which is quite a nice way of just using that data set.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I've just put a few links on screen to some really good places to get access to open data. There's obviously a huge amount of open data out there. Discovering a lot of it is sometimes the trickiest part. In terms of what are we doing next as Geovation, watch this space. We're trying to create a lot of tooling to work or make it easier to work with open data. So we'll be putting out announcements, hopefully to Slack and to our LinkedIn channels soon. So watch this space if you're a user of open data and want to make your life easier. I'm happy to take, or Dave and I are happy to take some questions now. We got one in the chat from who validates open data, as I have seen lots of errors from different data sets and it takes forever to get it changed when you reach out about the errors.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on so every data set will be different. Every data set will have a different publisher. Well, there'll be obviously groups of publishers in some cases. So it's a good question. There's no easy answer. It really depends on the feedback loop, I suppose, that has been put in place for that data set. In some cases, there'll be no kind of, I suppose, accountability or kind of no way of kind of doing anything, but probably the same would be true of a commercial data set. I've kind of found with open data, people are more cautious about open data, bizarrely, than they are about paid data, because they know it's kind of openly available and lots of people can look at it. They're kind of more cautious about releasing it. So I don't think there's a kind of quality issue with open data in that sense, that it's often kind of full of errors and hard to get changed. Perhaps hard to get changed in the sense that there might not be much money behind the people publishing it. But I don't think there's kind of a major quality issue with open data versus kind of data that you're paying for.
I can just add, I think a lot of the time when you're working in an organization that's maintaining open data, when you do get feedback, it's often quite hard to justify pulling people off kind of other projects to work on it, because if your organization isn't just set up to do open data and there's other priorities, it can be tricky. So that was definitely the case when I worked at a formal organization, where actually priorities were never the open data. The open data was always one of those things which was, we needed to do it. There was a lot of government organizations will have an obligation to put certain data out there, but it was always one of those things where actually putting fixes into it was always a tricky thing to do. So
yeah, just as one thing maybe to add on that as well. I think it has a kind of like a high level of quality to start off with, but then perhaps doesn't have in place the mechanism to kind of to deal with those issues as people raise them. When I worked in Bath, North Somerset, we released some data which was intentionally bad, which sounds a bit strange, but because we were quite open to releasing whatever we had, we weren't too bothered about the fact that we were releasing things that had errors in them, because the data was used, it did have errors in it. And we had some examples where the data wasn't errors as such, it was just quirks in the data. That's also something to kind of watch out for. We released car parking occupancy every 5 minutes, and quite often it would say that the car park is 110% full, and people would say, well, that's wrong. And it's not wrong. It's technically, it had measured more people going out than came in, and either people were sort of double parking or doing things like that, or sometimes the monitors would go wrong and you would get this discrepancy. But in terms of the data, that was what the data was telling us, and that was the accurate thing to publish. So it can be that it looks wrong, it isn't wrong, or it's a quirk of the underlying sort of systems that are behind it.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so thanks so very much for these robust time with you. I took time to listen to everything, but then my name is Bayo to start with, Bayo George. So I work in a prop tech company, UK-based prop tech company. So I was just wondering, I'd like to know what's your perspective about, particularly on the future of data sharing between public and private sector, especially within the property market, and then how how can a prop tech company participate in shaping the future of these kind of data sharing?
Was there any particular type of data you're talking about in terms of data sharing? Was it, personal data, or do you mean wider data in the property space?
Yeah, so I'm just I wanted your perspective about this, how the future of data sharing between the public and private sectors, okay? How this would be within the property market.
I think I would probably say, we're really lucky in the UK, like especially in the property sector space. The amount of open data that's available, it's absolutely incredible. If you look towards other countries, they don't have the equivalent of the EPC data being public. They don't have the equivalent of, your ONS data in terms of demographics, and all of that data is data that we see being used by prop techs in the space. There's some great examples of kind of open data kind of collectors and aggregators out there that are really good. we put a link into the chat. Sorry, there's a link on the last slide of planning data.gov.uk, I think it is, but it's a really good website if you want to look at kind of open data in the prop tech space. The other startup that I could really shout out that does great is Crystal Roof. I'll put a link in the chat. They do some great work with using open data and making it easy to understand at kind of a local level. But yeah, I would say in terms of like that data sharing mechanism, it depends on like what data and what granularity you want to go to. But I'd say the biggest factors would be, going back to those principles that we talked to at the very beginning. If you are using open data and sharing it with end users, try and explain the context of that data, where it's come from, how it's being used, and what's its purpose, and not try and deviate too far away from that. Does that answer your question, Bio?
Thank you for.
I think one thing to mention as well, I think with open data, there's almost this established convention that tends to be one way from public to private sector, or to the public, really, in terms of, so from the public sector to the public, and that could be to the private sector, or it could be an interested individual. There's probably not a lot of kind of data sharing the other ways. Let's say a private organization kind of sharing data back to the government. Probably because there's not much incentive, I suppose, or there's not all those kind of open knowledge principles don't tend to kind of apply so much in that sort of example. But it could certainly be one where actually I think we can make a lot more use of the data held within kind of private repositories, private organizations, whether or not it might be a case of recompensing those organizations for what they do, obviously, but kind of making sure all the data kind of amongst private operators, unless there's a major commercial reason where they wouldn't want it to be kind of opened up. There's a lot of potential for that data.
Tim, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. Very interesting. All the things you covered. Very interested in benches for various reasons. As ever, the elephant in the room when one talks about mapping and things like that is Google Maps. And I found I'm involved in trying to do a community health wellbeing map in the borough I live in Lewisham. And the thing about Google Maps, when you talk to very busy people, in the NHS, young entrepreneurs, very diverse group of them, of course, they've already got it on their phone. And so, therefore, as a way into the concept of how can you use maps, in the various ways you can use Google Maps, My Maps, and now they're definitely become more flexible with the multiple use of icons. Are people aware of any cases where trying to meld all this fantastic range, and as you say, we're privileged in the UK with the open source data, of trying to meld that with Google Maps so that those factors can come together? And just as a very last example, by chance, through this work a few years ago, I took the Director of Public Health in Lewisham to meet the top geospatial person at Google, Ed Parsons, and the discussion you could have about how we can, just do better on bringing the public and the private together. But going back to my question, it's, do people have experience of trying to at least connect these things more so that the advantages of getting people through the door on mapping through Google Maps, which obviously is unprecedented in human history, can work? Thanks. Very long question, but
No, I think I'll try and take it into parts. I don't know of anything off the top of my head in terms of good examples of it. I know Google has worked with organizations to kind of make access to their technology and their data easier for certain causes. But I've got no experience of being involved in that. All I would say, that there is two sides of that. Google Maps is effectively the application, the access method to Google. There's obviously also the data that Google holds. Now, Google's data is, incredible, and the mechanism it has of getting updates to it from user engagement and feedback is very good. But there are also lots of open data coming along that is in a very similar space that is also trying to tackle that need. Two data sets I'd point you at if you're interested. Obviously, there's OpenStreetMap in terms of the actual kind of mapping. Overture has also released it's got its first version of the data out there that is really good, and that has a lot of places data in it, which is very similar to the sort of data that you're getting out of Google in terms of locations, etc. That doesn't help you in terms of the access methodology, but Overture is there in terms of if you want actual data, it's really good data, and it's obviously international and open. The other data set that might be worth a look at if you're looking at like specific location data is Foursquare recently released their open data on places, which is a really interesting data. It's very noisy, and there's a lot of errors in it, but it's also a really good open data set that potentially might help in terms of access to some of that location-based data if that's what you're after. Hopefully that helped him.
I was going to mention there's a question in the chat as well related to Google, and one of the difficult things with using Google data, it mentioned in the chat that so my experience of Google is that they will let you sort of access their data. So they have incredible data on, say, let's say commercial premises, so supermarkets with opening times, all the kind of stuff that they, to be honest, make use of a lot of their users to kind of to keep up to date. But they don't allow you technically to access their data and display it on an alternative mapping engine. So it sort of becomes immediately has to be part of the Google ecosystem. So if you want to download their, let's say you search for supermarkets on Google, get a perfect list of supermarkets opening times, you have to kind of adopt their mapping to use their data. Now, it does make me think of like Lewis's early slide on kind of being a good data user. I mean, Google used lots of open data. So, you will put in a postcode to Google or name of a county, it will display the boundary line from official sources. It will use transportation data, bus stops, bus timetables, train timetables, all the kind of stuff that the Department of Transport have been amazing at kind of getting released as open data, but they will certainly not allow their data to be openly available or even really merged with other data sets or on other platforms. So it's a difficult one with Google because they have amazing data, but it's hard to have that kind of interoperability between their data sets and other ones.
Thanks very much for that and the point in the chat. Again, the example I'd give of trying to do this very specific thing, thinking of the tens of thousands of people in Lewisham who are in most health need, that the advantages of this massive crunching you've just pointed out that Google do. You get an example, my local neighborhood, if you look on OpenStreetMap, or certainly when I did on a particular study a year or so ago, it would show that there were still 2 banks in my area in Forest Hill. In fact, both of those banks closed down. And so, if you're a pensioner and, commercial premises, and of course you can map community premises on Google. I think Google are smart enough to know they're less likely to be lucrative for advertising than, say, supermarkets. But going back, they're very quick to show that things are closed down through their number crunching. And again, for people just looking for that hyper-local things, that will be a whole range from social enterprise, community to totally commercial. It has that advantages, and to me, it's somehow trying to get that these small things they do that's been mentioned on community things could be done more widely, even if they will never allow access to the data, because that's where they make their advertising money. But thanks anyway for the discussion.
No, you're welcome, Tim. It's worth having a look at the Overture data, because they also have the advantage that Google has, which is they can see the interactions that users are having with those assets. If you're not aware, Overture is backed by Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta would be the ones that would have a lot of the potential for interaction data. And so it's not a replacement for Google, but it might be some of the data that might help you understand and see if open data could be of help. So definitely have a look at it. I don't think we've got any other further questions in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time, and hopefully have a lovely rest of your day. Take care.